Okay, welcome to the lesson on sampling bias. So we actually saw in the last lesson multiple ways to sample from a population, and so today we're going to talk about we've already talked about this idea of variability and how bias is inherent in data, and bias will always be in our data, and so we just want to talk specifically about how biases can show up in our sample. So if you wanted to survey ODSS students, it's Orangeville District Secondary School, outline a strategy that would be unbiased and biased. So the point of this is just to kind of start thinking about, what would the survey look like if it was unbiased? What would it look like as biased? Not specifically asking you the type of sampling method, and although you can have that in your strategy, but we look at a survey that's unbiased and biased. And so certainly like a census would be unbiased, and a bias would be like asking your three of your friends. And so you can think of a strategy that another strategy that might be unbiased versus biased. We're in target 4. I know that the variability inherent in data can be caused by bias in the sample of the population. So that variability can be caused by the sample. I can identify types of bias and outline strategies to help reduce the bias for a more reliable and valid sample. And so really those strategies to help reduce the bias are using those sampling techniques. And it is going to be consistent with what we did in probability, talking about that law of large numbers. So remember what a representative sample is. Remember what a population is: a group of people stated specifically as desired that are to be studied. So you state the population. So if you look at different differences in these different types of populations, you can state it as specifically as you want. If you want the population to be all high school students at ODSS, you can say that. If you want population to be all high school students in Orangeville, you can say that. You just have to realize that the difference is being more specific. You're going to get an increased amount of bias depending on your sample. My guess is if you want to sample all high school students in the world, you're not going to do a very good job if you don't get a representative sample of the world. It's almost impossible to do. You can survey people on the internet, but how are you going to make sure the voices across the world are heard? My guess is if you want to sample all high school students in Canada, you're probably not going to get a good representation. You're going to miss people. You're going to miss voices. If you want all high school students in Orangeville, you have to look at the high school students in Orangeville. So if you looked at the different high schools, if you looked at the people that don't go to high school in Orangeville but go to high school just outside. If you want it, so you can say it more specific, and then it helps to reduce that bias because you're just stating this study works for students at this school or students in this town. It's important to say it doesn't necessarily work for all students in Canada or all students in Ontario. A sample is said to be representative if it accurately represents the population being studied. Kind of goes without saying there, representative means accurately represent the population. Demographic traits are what we're talking about here. So things like age, sex, gender, ethnicity, income status, race, religion, all of those kind of things come into play. Not all being very appropriate to ask all the time. Not all being I'm trying to find the word. Yeah, not all being appropriate to ask, ethical to ask. But that's why it's not just a matter of making it anonymous. That does help some ethics with respect to some of the questions you could ask to weed out the population, or to find out what voice is being heard when you do your sample or your study. But still, there's some questions that might be judged inappropriate to ask. So you have to keep in mind ethics here. We can never be perfect in sampling. There will always be bias, variability inherent in data. So one study is always going to be slightly different than another study, although we want to reduce that. Remember validity and reliability versus variability and bias. If a sample is reliable, the study could be duplicated. We'd get the same results if we did the study again with the same method. That's a definition that we want to know. If we increase the amount of people sampled, we'd get more accurate results. And it's really the same idea as your experimental probability approaching theoretical probability, that law of large numbers. If a sample is valid, the sample accurately represents the population. And so here's how it's related. Like the verse is kind of not very good, but this is how it's related to variability and bias. The less reliable and valid the sample is, the more biased it will be. The more biased the sample is, the more variability, the different results you're going to get. Okay. So sampling bias in general is when the sample simply does not accurately represent the population. Just simply, that's what sampling bias is. There's two types, and the first one is a specific type, and the other one is just generally sampling bias. Non-response bias is an important segment of the population is missing from the sample. So you are missing a segment that would have a strong voice that you want to hear. This segment will offer different opinions from those who were sampled. For example, the school surveyed students in senior grades to find out what they would like to see at the talent show. Well, the senior grades will have an opinion, but the junior grades will have another opinion, and they could potentially differ. So we need to hear from both of them. It's not a good, accurate representation of the population for people that are watching the talent show. Particularly so because the junior grades are probably going to be more represented at the talent show, although all students will be there. It is a specific type of bias. The other type is just regular sampling bias, and that's just there is some kind of problem with the way the sample was chosen. It wasn't anonymous. Sorry, that's a measurement bias, but the sample was chosen in an inappropriate way. The sampling technique wasn't used. You didn't have enough people sampled. That kind of thing. Like you heard from everybody, but you just don't get this kind of law of large numbers. You didn't hear enough voices, or it's just you're missing multiple segments of the population. So if we can say it's like if it's just one segment particularly missing, that could be non-response. Like for example, you might say that a good sample is studying people at Walmart, and so we say, all right, I'm going to go into Walmart, and I get a good idea that this fairly accurately represents the population. But you might be missing that segment, that non-response bias. For the non-response bias, you might be missing a segment of the population that they're really hard to describe, but they potentially don't want to shop at Walmart. And so now you ask yourself, like, is that segment of the population, is that somebody that I need to hear from? And it is potentially this segment of the population that's against big business. And so if you're putting a survey about having something about the economy or something about big businesses, you definitely want to hear from the other people. You definitely want to do that same survey as well at little shops on Broadway to make sure that you get both voices. Sampling bias also often results from convenient sampling. The reason why we go to Walmart is because it's convenient. Like we can get a lot of the people there. But if we invest a little bit more time, money into it, we can maybe reduce some of that bias. So how could techniques be biased? So we just go through each one. Simple random sampling. Simple random sampling is actually a tremendous type of sampling method. The problem with trying to get everybody having the same chance of being in your survey or chance of being represented is it's very expensive. It is actually really hard to do. It's really hard to get everybody a voice. And so just to do a simple random sample is a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of time and money. And so it's a tremendous sample. It actually isn't biased. It's not as biased if you can get a lot of people. But law of large numbers, you need that. And so if you only have a few people, that's how it's biased. Systematic, the exact same thing. It is actually a tremendous sampling technique as well if we can systematically pick people, because like it is actually random. Think about the system of having people in a list and taking people out of the phone book alphabetically, taking every 20th person or 100th person or something like that. It almost is random with the technique. So if you don't take enough people, like you only take every 1,000th person out of the phone book, and you don't have a big sample, it's going to be biased. Cluster sampling, another great sampling technique. So remember that's when you have people in groups. You have a bunch of groups, so everybody is in some kind of group, and we randomly select some of the groups, and we hear from everybody in the group. So classes in a school, we randomly select some classes. We take the entire class. Again, it could be biased if the groups are too big, and you're only taking one group. There you can get biased because, and also if you only say the groups are small but they're very specific, but we only randomly pick 3 groups, and say for classes like they're all science classes or they're all English class. Well, English isn't a very good example, but they're all senior math classes. That's not a good representation of the population. They're all just senior classes. That's not a good representation either. Stratified, it's the same idea. It's like people are in groups. Maybe you potentially have bigger groups here. So you could have the school in grade 9, 10, 11, 12, and you just don't take enough people. Like there's always a sample size issue, like if you don't take enough people. But if you take enough people, like it generally is actually good representation. A lot of these things are actually ironed out because these are really good sampling techniques. They are ironed out by not taking enough people. Multi-stage, same idea. So we've done a great job at combining sampling techniques, potentially picking a random neighborhood, then a random street in that neighborhood, and then taking some houses. But if we don't take enough of these random neighborhoods, then we're going to get bias. And if we only take a few of these random neighborhoods, and they're all in the same kind of representation, so the same economic background, same income level, then we're not necessarily getting a good sample. Voluntary sampling, well, remember that this is when you actually have they come to you, so you have some kind of incentive or sometimes maybe a chance to win something, and so you're voluntarily sampling them. And really, if they don't want the prize, then they won't do it. And so oftentimes here you don't hear from customers that maybe don't want your prize. And so maybe you're offering a service as the prize, and they just don't want it. And then you'll always get people that are kind of a little bit, they really just don't want to have to go out of their way to do something. And that's fine, but you're not here. Now you got to ask yourself, do you want to hear their voice for some other reason? Convenience sampling, and that's an obvious one. So if I just go outside my house and start to survey people on my street, I get a very skewed representation of the population. Again, I don't get to hear from a lot of the same people. A census actually isn't really biased. It does take in everybody's opinion. However, because you're asking so many people, the bias that you could be running up against is that they just didn't take it seriously. So say we surveyed the entire school, but we always get this bias because they just didn't take it seriously. And so we had so many out there, and there's so many the biases, and I mean, I guess you'll always get this, but there's a bigger chance with a bigger group to get this idea. And if you need to hear from everybody and you force people to actually do it, because like simple random sample, I would always think that if you had a survey, then you maybe ask them if they want to do it. And that doesn't make it voluntary response. It just kind of doesn't alienate the people. There's probably still some bias there and so you can already see like it's impossible to avoid this, where you're going to get the type that will never do your survey when you ask them. So if you ask them, they'll say no. And maybe you want to hear that person's voice, a certain type of personality. The question is, what is best? So obviously, a census is probably the best thing, but not when you take into account time versus money. Really, when it comes down to it, simple random sample is probably the best method. They all have like their advantages, even convenient sampling, where it's what's convenient to you. And if it's not a big deal that there's some bias in the sample, maybe convenience is okay. In our culminating assignment, it's not going to be such a big deal that the sample's biased. We can discuss how the sample is biased, and so convenience will be okay. Some practice questions to look at. These are really just reflection questions for you to go over. Assume you had access to enough resource sample from the entire population. How could you ensure that a random sample would accurately represent it? So this is saying, assuming you could get to everybody, how would you make sure that a random sample would do it? Using sampling techniques, outline a strategy that would take a sample of the population of all ODSS students that have non-response, have sampling, have little. So this again is a good thing to think about. How would you answer a question like that if it came up on a test? Explain why there will always be variability inherent in data, and so we kind of said that, right? Like there's always going to be something wrong with our sampling. And the only strategy to continue to totally have a completely valid and reliable study is to do a census, including your answer an example of the best sample possible and why it's not possible always to do a census. Okay? There's a few homework or textbook questions as well.